With the Eco Divers Foundation, and back in 2014 I sat down and started putting our program together, and over the course of the last several years we have been able to not only harvest coral off of our local reefs to put into a nursery environment and grow into a larger quantity of coral to return out to the reef. We've actually been able to manage 3 separate nursery site locations, and we're just adding a 4th one as we speak. And we have grown those original fragments of coral into a substantial amount with a well thought out plan to move them back out onto the reef. And that's where all of you can come in, where you can help contribute to this program and follow along with our progress, because many of the options that are out there that talk about reef restoration are largely photo opportunities, and without a clear-cut plan for how they're going to return that coral to the reef, well, they're not going to get the results that we need. And I hate to say it, but right now we've lost 95% of the coral across the Caribbean Sea, and that's a cataclysmic number. And without a very dedicated and motivated group to get those corals back out in a well thought out manner, we are going to continue to see setbacks and loss and continued expansion of about 1% per year of that existing coral disappearing. To put that in perspective, when I first sat down and did my documentation for our coral conservation course last summer, the percentage was 94%, and it's gone up to 95% since then. We need to stop that. Many of the programs that are out there are doing a great job identifying the corals, naming them, cataloging them, studying their nuances, but we need to start getting more of that coral back out onto the reef, because if we don't, it is disappearing, and it is disappearing at an accelerating rate. Many people misunderstand and think that the coral in the Caribbean Sea is disappearing because of human impacts and global warming. Don't get me wrong, global warming has had a very real impact, and when we say that, what we actually mean is rising water temperatures in the Caribbean Sea. Because what most people don't appreciate is that global warming doesn't mean the air is getting hotter or it's sunny right there, or it's changing issue on a large landmass like in the central United States or Canada. What it means is the overall temperature of everything, and we're mostly an aquatic planet, is going up. And since we're mostly an aquatic planet, that's where most of it is being held in. And that poses a very unique problem for us as we move forward. But our original problem was disease, and it still threatens us even to this day. So all of our conservation efforts have to be built with those 2 very real factors underlying every decision that we make. To give you an idea of how complex some of this is, several years ago, a dust storm in the Sahara Desert blew some dust up out the middle of the desert there and blew it high up into the atmosphere. And this dust had some bacteria on it. That happens, it's not unusual at all. And that dust was blown across the Atlantic Ocean. And when it reached the Caribbean Sea area, it met with our large, very moisture-laden clouds, and you mix the dust and the moisture together and it creates rain. And when it rained out of the clouds, that dust fell into the sea. And that dust that fell into the sea still had bacteria on it from in the Sahara Desert. And that bacteria on that dust, when it fell off into the water, spread around, and it found all the different stuff growing there in the water. And of everything that was there, it found one organism that it was interested in consuming. It's gone after it pretty aggressively. And if you've seen our large purple sea fans in the recent years, you may have noticed that we have these weird grayish black spots that start forming and get bigger and bigger until all it is just the branches of the sea fan, and all the gaps in the middle have rotted away. And that's that bacteria. And unfortunately, it's been spread all throughout the Caribbean. That bacteria flew halfway around the world and found one particular organism that it wants to eat. It's very selective and a kind of difficult thing to avoid. So our only effort that we can put forward that's a practical and real-world solution is genetic diversity. And I don't mean getting 75 different species of coral out there, although that would be neat if it happened in nature. But instead, we take one species like the Acroporus urbicornis that we're working with here in the Cayman Islands. And instead of taking one piece, fragmenting it, turning it into 10,000 smaller pieces, letting each of those grow to be something hand-sized, and then moving all 10,000 pieces, which are clones of one another, out onto a section of reef and placing them there, and then being ecstatic over our results as in the next year or two, watching those corals get big, knowing that in the back of our head, that if one disease rolls through that targets that one particular coral that we started with, it's going to kill all the other clones we made of it in very short order and mitigate all of our effort. Instead, we need to find a wide range of genetically unique corals of the same species and mix them together, make little clusters of intense coral diversity, and allow those corals a chance to breed. In fact, that's what we're doing here this week. We're out there filming our corals while they're spawning in our nurseries and our outplant sites. And they only spawn once a year. So we have to put some thought and effort into it, because if we mess things up, we don't get a chance until about this time next year. And if we do that right, when those corals do spawn and we get that big mass of various corals mixing together, their spawn is going to settle within the next 2 kilometers of where they started at downstream, whatever direction the current happens to be blowing at a time. And if we take, say, 5 to 10 unique species and disease comes through and would wipe out half of them, well, if they've had a few years to breed, they've created innumerous new genetically diverse corals downstream from where they're at. And that means that while we may have lost 5 out of the original 10, the remaining 100 or however many it works out to be could potentially all be saved. Or any ones that were related to the 5 may be taken out. But we still end up with a huge number of genetically diverse corals. And that has always been the safety mechanism used here in the Caribbean region. We have to embrace that, because we as a whole do not have a good track record when we try manipulating stuff. And there's talk of super corals and talk of all sorts of different ways where we can kind of force coral to behave in the manner in which we want it to behave in. And that's a dangerous thing, because if we start changing those corals on a fundamental level like that, many of these organisms, they predate trees. The relationship coral has with the zooxanthellae algae that lives in the layers of its skin is reported at about 150 million years old. That means that for some reason or another, that particular mechanism has worked over multiple extinction events and other cataclysmic failures of the species. And if we tamper with that too much, we may take that resilience away. And even with a short-term problem like we're facing right now with the rising water temperatures and climate change, we could end up wiping those corals out over the course of the long run. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to have problems with climate change. As I say, disease is our biggest problem, and because of that, we need to create as much genetic diversity as is possible. But we also need to face reality. Reality says it's hotter in the water right there today than it was 10 years ago. And it's hotter now today than it was 20 years ago. And we've got hotter, sunnier days and different weather patterns that are blowing through. And as a result, in our program, we start at 40 foot deep. The reason we start at 40 foot deep is because when a storm rolls by, it's going to create large surge action. It's going to do damage to the reef. It's going to do damage to our nursery structures. If we're down below that 40 foot level, we may wiggle around a little bit. We may definitely feel some of the surge action, but it's not going to be a catastrophic loss. And when we put our corals down, I'm not going through that work for it to be wiped out in 2 to 5 years. I expect that coral to have a good long life because I made intelligent choices of where to put the coral. If I'm not making intelligent choices, I need to go back and analyze what factors cause those corals to die and how I undo that so that I make good choices from then forward. Definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results. When we place our corals in a safe area like that, we can expect long-term survival. But I have some bad news for many of the programs throughout the Caribbean. Where we remember coral historically being at is not where it is going to survive at. And even worse, if you look at the projected models for the next 50 years and 100 years, things aren't going to get better. We need to look with an honest eye at, while certain places may be convenient, they may also be a lost cause. We have to find the balance between the effort we put out and the results we're going to get, and be fair with ourselves and with the world that we have helped directly create, whether by our own hand or by allowing it to happen around us. And if we're working in water that's less than 30 or 40 foot deep, we have to accept the reality that we are probably working in an area that will not support those corals for the long term. And if we are going to put that effort in, we need to have a good reason why. And I actually have some thoughts there. One of the things that we do by putting our corals out around 40 to 60 foot on the reef is, well, for one, it's safe for divers to get out there and do a fair amount of work in the water. But more to the point, our island is kind of shaped like this. And this little bit right here in the middle, this is the island that we see. And this long slope here, this is all this area out here, all the way out to where the cruise ships are at. And it's only like 50, 60 foot deep right there. That's the real edge of the island. And at the cruise ships, our island drops off vertical, down well over 1,000 feet. It's 1,300 feet just on the other side of the pirate ship right there. And because of that, this little slope right here, this is where most of our corals exist at. People keep trying to put them right up here in the real shallow area, but really we need to be out at this end here. The reason I say that is, over the last 100,000 years, ice ages have come and gone. As the world gets colder and the ice gets thicker and thicker, it takes more and more water up out of the surrounding seas and the water level drops. And it could be as much as a 200+ foot cliff right over there that's currently covered with 60 foot of water. But our corals moved up and down that cliff, didn't they? It took them probably a couple hundred, if not a couple thousand years to do that. But if we start our corals off here, instead of up here when they spawn, every year when they spawn, they'll put some up here in the shallows, and that's nice. It looks pretty, and divers get to enjoy that. But more to the point, they're going to kick some off the side, down to 80, 100, maybe beyond 100 foot deep. And as they do, those corals that land down in those deeper waters, they're going to grow slowly, because there's not the same intensity of light reaching them. But they're going to grow safely, because storm surge won't reach down 100 feet, because it's one hell of a storm. And predators don't move down there because that's not part of their native range. Maybe new predators that we don't anticipate could be down there, but by migrating slowly down the side of the wall over the course of several hundred years, corals have survived events where this whole area here that is currently a reef was exposed to air and was hundreds of feet up. We didn't give the corals hundreds of years to make that adjustment. Instead, with the climate change that we're going through, we gave them about 15 or 20 years, and they're not making it. And on top of that, anybody here learn how to fight when you're in kindergarten? You always try to pick a fight with a guy who's not paying attention and who's smaller than you? Well, that's how nature's working with us as well. They're kicking us while we're down. While we've already got all these climate change going on, they also threw a real strong bout of disease onto us, and that's wiped out most of the Caribbean corals there. And unfortunately, that means that we're starting at a severe disadvantage and with a very short timetable to work with. So we have to anticipate that movement for the coral and put it in the best position to be able to spawn off the side. Because in 50 years, that whole 60-foot ledge might be inhospitable to coral. All the work we're doing in 40, 50 foot might be for loss also, and everything that's going anywhere else in those same ranges. But those corals at 80, 100, 150 foot, they may even be migrating down to 200 foot at that point, just on that slow growth cycle. By our 50th year from now, I would hope that most people have caught on to the fact that things are going kind of pear-shaped on us, and we've made a mess and need to start undoing stuff. I know there's a very topical issue in Florida right now with dumping from industrial plants into local waterways, and it's caused a lot of algae buildup, and it's been kind of a big thing. We may find that becomes more and more a topic of concern. But it doesn't matter whether we stop right now or in 50 years, we're still riding that wagon until it comes naturally to a halt. So even if it takes us 50 years, we're going to see those changes regardless. And then, and only once we make that about face and start undoing some of the self-destructive projects that we have, we can start to slow down that temperature gain and possibly even start reversing it. So maybe 100 years down the road or 200 years down the road, those deep water corals may be the only symptoms or examples of the acropores and the other shallow reef corals that we have enjoyed for the last 30 or 40 years here in the Caribbean. And by virtue of having those down there, we can go down on specialized gear, collect those, put those back into nursery environments as the waters begin to cool back down, as the environment becomes hospitable again, and move them back in, a seed bank, if you will. But we have to think these things through. We have to figure what our impact is going to be, how nature runs its own course, how to best incorporate it, and how to use this as our ally and not as our adversary. And I'm afraid many programs I've heard of, they treat it as an enemy and a force to overcome, and in fact it's not. It's not doing anything that we haven't directly helped happen. We need to accept the fact that it is absolutely an ally in our struggle, but sometimes what we encourage it to do doesn't seem like a good idea after it starts happening, and that's not its fault, that's ours. That actually leads me into a fun little segue there about sunscreen. I think everybody here understands the importance of reef-safe sunscreen, right? Y'all wearing that stuff, it's important, but it's probably not important for the reason that you think. It's actually more important for someone like myself. It's not because I spend all my days in the water and it's gonna like kill the coral. It's because reef-safe sunscreen is non-carcinogenic. It means it doesn't have ingredients that cause cancer. That's why it's important, because guess what non-reef safe, or the old stuff has? It's a chemical in there, the oxybenzcodoline, that is a known carcinogen. Don't worry, if you've been using your sunscreen, you're okay, unless you use it every day, like me, for a decade or more. And that could turn into a problem. The trick with that is, oxybenzcodoline, it's just a little tiny amount that it's going to be carcinogenic. And that's where you get a lot of the argument, oh, it's such small amounts. Yeah, there's a little bit of truth to that. But the problem is, you know, when you put lotion on and how it smooths right into your skin, it helps soak right in, you wait a few minutes, it's like it wasn't even there. Well, there's chemicals that do that. They're called transporters. They basically take that chemical, that oxybenzcodoline, and smush it through your skin, down into your fatty tissues, down into your blood vessels, down into the feet of your arm, and bring that carcinogen right down through the layers of skin into all those final destinations in your body where it accumulates. So if, like me, you've been applying that on a regular basis, you may find that the health risk involved with the constant application of that carcinogenic compound outweighs the benefit that it would have given you to avoid the radiation burns from getting sunburned. And don't get me wrong, if somebody's here on vacation for 2 weeks and it's them and their husband or wife and their kids, and I would no sooner tell them not to put sunscreen on their kids than I'd tell them to poke the kid in the eye with a sharp stick. That'd be a horrible thing for me to do. How could I possibly live with myself that evening watching the kids cry because they've been sunburned so badly? We need to treat sunscreen in an intelligent manner and quit just believing everything that the label says. Because the label, even if it says reef safe, well, all you do is you turn around on the back, you look for those 4 primary ingredients that are the problem, the transporters and the carcinogens. And if you look on the back there, and it says inactive and active ingredients, and for the inactive ingredients, it's got all the carcinogens. You know what someone did? They just got creative with their labeling, changed some of that stuff around. So on the front they could say reef safe, and gullible people would buy it. But in reality, if you look on the back, it says that it's the same stuff as what they've been packaging the entire time. And for some reason, by saying it's inactive, it makes it okay. I mean, to be quite honest, unless it's like yeast or beer or kombucha or something like that that has a living element to it, what does inactive versus active mean for a chemical compound that's been mixed up in a jar and then straight in? It's nonsense terms, in fairness. And if you do flip it over on the back and it doesn't have those carcinogenic things, oftentimes it'll even say vegan right on the front. Don't get me wrong, I'm not vegan myself. I eat fish, I do all that sort of stuff. I try to be responsible with everything, but that vegan label is important because it indicates that that sunscreen, okay, well, your friends would make fun of you for this, but in theory, you could eat it, digest it, and pass it through your body safely. And it's not made with any animal products. And by using that reef-safe sunscreen that is vegan, that is missing those carcinogens, when you apply it onto your skin, what you're doing, if you go out into the water there, is you're helping give the corals cancer. But just like you, it would take repeated, constant exposure to those chemicals to give corals cancer, and we have a lot bigger problem. See, if I put normal sunscreen on this arm, and reef-safe sunscreen on this arm, and I jump into a bathtub, or better yet, for many of you that are reef keepers, I reached into your aquariums and started feeling for stuff. Which arm do you think the sunscreen would come off of first? What if I just put the reef-safe sunscreen arm in and wiggled it around? Would that be okay with you guys? Would you feel good about that? Because, you know, it's basically just soap, right? It just rubs right on, and when you expose it to water, it just leaks right off. And if it does, sunscreen has one job. There's only one thing it needs to do, and it's in the name. It has to block sunlight. And our corals rely on sunlight reaching them. Inside the layers of their skin, there's little zooxanthellae algae. And that's not a algae, it's a community of algae. It's like your yard back home. There's grass versions and tree versions, and some do good in heat, some do good in cold. But all those little zooxanthellae algae, they're photosynthetic. But if we take something and cover those zooxanthellae algae, blocking them away from the sun, they're going to stop doing their photosynthetic activity. That provides 80% of the nutrition for a coral. I mean, they got little tentacles, but if we lay that stuff over them, the tentacles got to reach up through that sludge anyways to catch something to eat. That's a problem there in and of itself. So it doesn't really matter which one you put on. If they both rinse off and settle down onto the bottom and put a thin layer of sunscreen all over the reef, it prevents algae from growing, prevents anything from growing that's not that depends on photosynthesis. And when we run into a situation like that, well, there is solutions, but again, you have to be intelligent and be thoughtful about how you're doing this. First off, they make reef-safe waterproof sunscreens. You apply it, rub it on. It has kind of a sticky texture, but it's because it's sticking to your skin. It holds on. Now, don't get me wrong, if you jump in the water and you swim around for an hour, some of it's going to come off, but not nearly as much as if you just put the regular sunscreen on that washes right off very easily. And that means if I jump in the water and do 15 to 30 minutes swimming around, I get out for a snack and I put more sunscreen on, I get back in the water, and I swim around for a while, and then it's lunchtime, so I get back out. I put more sunscreen on for lunch, and I get back in after lunch. I put 3 applications of sunscreen to cover my whole body into the area in the beach where I'm at. If I use it waterproof, I might only have to put it on one time, and it's still on by that 3rd swim. That works pretty good. That's a huge drop in the amount of sunscreen that's going into our water, which is important because when's the last time you went to the beach and there was nobody else there? All those people every day, year after year, adding all that sunscreen into the surrounding water. And what happens is after a couple days, honestly, the reef safe stuff tends to break down, but the non-reef safe, it doesn't. It stays quite a bit longer, but if it's being applied every day, it doesn't matter if it breaks down or not. It still blocks the sunlight, it still smothers and stops oxygen exchange. The stuff starves to death, suffocates, and it's not going to come back. We have to accept the reality that some places where we do a whole lot of tourist activity or we encourage a lot of people to go to the beach, we might not be able to put coral back in those regions safely. There are other options. Like right here, we have this great long sleeve rash guard right here. Sponsored by Polyplab, Cayman Eco Divers, and Sustainable Marine. Notice the long sleeve here. Look how much sunlight comes through that. Can you see that? I see a little bit of pinpoints of light, but not a whole lot. It's effective SPF protection all the way down to my wrist. You know, if I have something like that on, and I do have an issue, I put a little bit of waterproof sunscreen on the tops of my hands, on my nose, got a big nose, that's important. Maybe on the tops of my feet, people get those flip-flop sunburns on the tops of their feet, but otherwise, you'll be all right in the water. And, you know, if we make thoughtful decisions like that, wearing a hat, wearing long sleeve shirt to protect us from the sun, we can reduce that volume. Right now it's about the equivalent of 6 metric tons of sunscreen going into our seas every year, which the size of the seas, the volume of water there wouldn't be a big deal, except it's concentrated all right there on the water's edge where everybody goes, and only in the most popular spots, which oftentimes are near where reefs are at that people would want to see anyways. So it's like we scouted out the most problematic areas for us to put all that sunscreen, and we intentionally are dumping it right there. That's kind of my little rant about sunscreen. I think many people are aware of the issue of the reef-safe sunscreen, but grossly misunderstand what it is, what it's doing, and how to actually make a productive effort to contribute to that and get the results that you want. Because when people say, I'm getting reef-safe sunscreen to help save the reefs, they don't mean to help keep the reef from getting cancer 10 years down the road. They mean to keep putting it on it in the first place, and that's the option right there that keeps the sunscreen off it in the first place. The reef-safe sunscreen is more for your protection long term, or I should say more importantly, my protection.